Okay, and you can just pass those in. End of class, we're still filling out a sheet right now. There we go. Remember, we're discussing Primo Levi on Tuesday, and so today we're going to talk about the Holocaust. And if you remember, one of the things that I've tried to hit on, and one of the things that I asked you to think about the first week of class, was the entire concept of historiography. That is, not just sort of what history is, name, dates, facts, but how history is organized in arguments, the way in which it is contested, the way in which various interpretations of history exist, at times almost sort of simultaneously. Today, we're going to be talking about the Holocaust and the emergence of what we think of as the Holocaust. That is, the systematic extermination of millions of people, the vast majority of them European Jews, between roughly early 1942 and the first couple of months of 1945. And there are several things I want to talk about in regard to how this happens, but I want to foreground it by saying that there is, among historians, if not a debate, there is still a discussion about the nature of the Holocaust. It's something that came up most recently about 15 years ago in a whole flurry of books published about it. One by a man named Goldhagen called Hitler's Willing Executioners, which was a big one, and one that really sort of restarted this debate. And there's let me just give you the outlines of it, and then I'll talk about this within those sort of outlines. That is, there are those who argue that in essence, the Holocaust, in particular, the extermination of people, the death camp system, is the absolutely foreseeable, or was the absolutely foreseeable, the absolutely inevitable outcome of the Nazi seizure of power. That is, from the moment the Nazis took power in Germany in 1933, from the moment Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany in 1933, the Holocaust is inevitable. That's one argument that's made. That the Holocaust, the mass extermination of Jews, is built into the system from the start. Some historians who subscribe to this and argue that it's there in the nature of the rhetoric about Jews, the nature of the rhetoric about Jews in particular as parasites, as sort of traitors, as treasonous, as untrustworthy, all of these things, that's sort of built in. That circumstances may have changed a little bit, but this is an inevitability. That this is something that is bound to happen. That there exists within Germany a profound level of anti-Semitism, a pervasive level of anti-Semitism that is so great that it amounts to what is called eliminationist anti-Semitism. These are the people who, as I said, they grouped into the school called the intentionalist argument about the Holocaust. That it was intended from the start, that it's built in from the start. The other argument is that the Holocaust is not the creation of the death camps and the creation of the extermination system is not necessarily something that is there fully from the start. That yes, the idea of removing Jews from German territory is there from the start, but that the actual creation of the death camp system is a function. These are called the functionalists. That is a function of what happens to Germany between 1933 and 1945. In particular, what happens to Germany from 1939 onwards. That the death camp system is the result of other German aims. In particular, the German aim to create Lebensraum, to create this enormous self-sufficient territory in Eastern Europe, and that the byproduct of which is the absorption of millions of Jews into German or under German control, and the desire ultimately to get rid of them in the only way possible, given that they could not emigrate, they could not be evacuated, they could not be forced out. The idea is that there is a, basically, the Holocaust as it emerges is a function of what happens in Germany. It is not the intention of the Germans from the very start. Now, to further confuse things, my argument lies somewhere in the middle. This is why people hate me talking about things. That is, that I think there is an element of both at play here. That is, the intention of the Germans, the intention of the Nazi regime, was and remained the removal of Jews from all German territory. That Jews could not exist in German territory. But the idea that the actual death camp system itself is there and present, and this idea of mass murder is present in 1933 in the form it takes, is, I think, to stretch it a little far. Instead, there is certainly there the willingness to kill Jews. Of that, there's no doubt. There's a willingness to think about mass murder. Absolutely. The willingness to engage in genocide. But to argue that it is intended from 1933 is, I think, a little bit of a stretch. So my argument is, in essence, that you have, from the start, a German intent to get rid of Jews and others who are deemed undesirable, deemed as sort of dangerous to the German national well-being, but that the form it takes actually owes a lot to several things. It owes something to the conduct of the war. It owes something to German war aims. And it also owes something to the way in which German approaches to the question of undesirable populations changed over the course of the 1930s and early 1940s. Basically, my argument is that there is an intention from the start to remove Jews from German territory. Is there an intention from the start to engage in genocide? I'd say no. There's probably a willingness to examine genocide and a willingness to think about genocide. Probably, if you ask the Nazis in 1933 from their rhetoric and from other things, you can say there was a willingness to engage in genocide, but there wasn't an actual decision to engage in genocide until you get to the war. Is everyone with me on this? And I think that there is a level of anti-Semitism in Germany that allows for and fosters the Nazi decision to remove Jews from German territory over the course of the 1930s. Do all Germans immediately, or do all Germans deep down believe that all Jews should be killed? Is a different question, and I think one that's much harder to answer. What I do think is that there was, among many Germans, a sentiment that did not necessarily care if Jews were killed. Didn't actually desire to participate fully in the killing, but were also not bothered, or at least a majority seem not to have been bothered too much by what went on. So we'll talk about this question of responsibility and accountability a little bit later. I want to start, though, with what happens, and we're going to work a little bit backwards. Start with what happens in Warsaw in 1943. Part of the death camp system that is created is a system whereby Jews will be moved out of, for example, the Polish countryside and concentrated in ghettos. Specific areas within cities like Krakow, Lodz, Warsaw, in Poland in particular. There'll be others in Lithuania and Latvia, and even parts of the Soviet Union, while the Germans occupied it. And the idea is that they will be then transported from Warsaw, from these ghettos, to the death camps for extermination. Some will be worked to death, others will be instantly put to death. In Warsaw, in 1943, there is a growing understanding among the Jews of Warsaw, nearly 1 million packed into this very small area, that they are being transported to their deaths. There is, in fact, an uprising. And it's one that is absolutely and brutally crushed by the Germans. But I think it's important to start here because it shows a little bit this system now in place. By this point now, the system had been in place for about a year, since the middle of 1942. But it also shows a definite awareness. Those Jews who knew what they were being transported to, those Germans who were aware that they were being transported to, and many Poles who witnessed it. That is the one thing at the start, I think, that the Warsaw Ghetto uprising helps to dispel, is the notion that somehow all of this was achieved without anyone really knowing. At the end of the war, and particularly in the 1960s to the 1970s, as West Germany was rehabilitated and brought into the NATO alliance and made a firm partner in the Cold War sort of pact against the Soviet bloc, there was a lot of talk about the way in which, for example, the Nazis had sort of hijacked Germany. The Nazis had done lots of things that the Germans weren't quite aware of. One thing that the Warsaw Ghetto uprising demonstrates is just how pervasive the knowledge was of what was going on. That Germans, Jews, Poles, Polish Jews, German Jews, others gathered in this, all understood exactly what was going on at Sobibor and Treblinka, the two camps nearest Warsaw, that were the death camps assigned to this ghetto. So you have an element there that there is a sense of what's going on. And it's not limited to Warsaw, it's not limited to Poland or to Germans serving in Poland. By 1943, there was fairly extensive knowledge in other parts of Europe and even in the United States of at least the parameters of the death camp system. What the Germans had been up to, how German supplies were being moved. A lot of it was intelligence being passed on by various resistance movements. In France, in the Netherlands, and especially in Poland, where there were both Jewish and non-Jewish resistors, and in particular, where some members of the Catholic clergy were passing to their other authorities, bishops, clerics, and ultimately alerting the Vatican and Rome as to what was going on. That is, by 1943, influential American Jewish political lobbying groups and philanthropic groups, like the American Jewish Congress, they knew that the mass slaughter of Jews was taking place. They didn't know the exact sort of, demarcations of the camp system or something like that, but they knew. The Vatican knew. And some, especially in some Polish Catholic clergy, acted enormously bravely to try to rescue people. To try and, in essence, sort of hide them, move them, at times actually literally baptize them and rename them to keep them safe. Not in the sense that the baptism was actually converting them, but that this was being done to preserve them. One of the things that is debated in 1943 and early 1944 in Washington and in London is what to do about this. And ultimately the decision is made not to go after these camps. It's a controversial decision that remains to this day, or that remains controversial, not to go after these camps. Their location, their military value, humanitarian value aside, was judged not to be significant. That they were too hard for American and British bombers to get to. That the Soviets did not have the capacity at the time to take them out. And that the resources that would need to be devoted to it could be better used elsewhere in the war. So there is, and this is one thing that's sort of been generally sort of muddled up since the end of the war, there is an understanding of what's going on. It's not the case, as often is presented the case, that the Americans, many American troops, many ordinary American soldiers, even American officers, they didn't know. But within the American government, within the British government, within the highest ranks of, for example, the Catholic Church's hierarchy, within the larger Jewish philanthropic world in North America and Europe and elsewhere, there is an understanding of what's going on. But it is a, how should I put it? It's not something that is prioritized, because it is not seen as part of winning the war. That ending this is not the end of the war, but rather will be sort of a byproduct of the end of the war. One thing we may talk about is that when the Americans go to war in late 1941, when Hitler does Roosevelt the favor of declaring war on him, one of the things that is very much at the forefront of American policymakers and public relations officials and publicists, propagandists, whatever you want to call them, is that they have to frame the war in Europe in a certain way. But they cannot frame it as a war to save European Jews, primarily. That is, they have to frame the Nazi threat in a very different way, because there is real concern that the American public is not going to go for a massive war effort in Europe designed to rescue Jews. One of the very interesting things, and if we have a chance, we'll watch this later this semester, is a propaganda film made in 1942 by Frank Capra, the man who made Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, what is it? You know, the Christmas movie. It's a Wonderful Life? Yes. You know, Jimmy Stewart, etc. He made a series of films to be shown to American recruits, to be shown generally to the American public. They were entitled, Why We Fight. And the first one is this sort of long-form documentary that outlines sort of what the Japanese are up to, what the Italian fascists are up to, what the Nazis are up to. And it talks about the Nazis in very sort of general terms, and it says the Nazis hate religion. And it shows them breaking stained glass windows in a Christian church, or rocks breaking stained glass windows in a church. But it gives equal play. It says basically the Nazis, they show 4 different religious texts, in essence, going up in flames as a result of Nazi persecution. That is, they show the Torah, the Old Testament, they show the Christian Bible, they show the Quran, and then they show the Analects of Confucius. All of which are given equal play. Only one of which group, of course, is actually the target of the Nazis. But to the American public, it could not be sold as rescuing American Jews or targeting the Nazis because they were persecuting Jews. It had to be placed more broadly as they are persecuting all religion. So it's a very sort of, it's a very tenuous situation that the American administration faces, the Roosevelt administration faces, because they want to get people behind this war effort. But at the same time, there are elements of this war effort that they cannot highlight in order to sustain that enthusiasm. Okay, so you have the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Ultimately, several 100,000 people die. The rest are deported. These are pictures of people being taken to the trains in Warsaw in early 1943. This is one of the things that sparks the uprising. You can see people wearing armbands, for example, if not badges on their coats, at least armbands. And then the German army comes in and puts down the Warsaw Uprising. And as I said, by the end of 1943, you've got 200,000 people dead. And it took the German army a while because people had dug themselves in, people had hidden themselves, people were participating in sabotage and raids, attacks on German soldiers. But ultimately, pretty much the Warsaw Ghetto, this section of Warsaw, is razed, is destroyed, basically reduced to rubble in order to facilitate the movement of Jews into the camps. That's another thing. The amount of time and energy the Nazis spent on putting down the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, on ensuring that every Jew in Warsaw had been deported to the camps or had been killed, is a demonstration of something else. That, well, the means by which the Nazis will seek to eliminate Jews will change over the 30s and 40s. It is at least central to the Nazis themselves, to the Nazi leadership, that Jews must be eliminated. And that any and all resources can be used to that end. That is, the elimination of Jews, whether by forced deportation, by slave labor, ultimately by extermination in camps, This is central to the Nazi ideology. It is so central, I mentioned before, it's what sets the Nazis apart from the Italian fascists. At the heart, there is this desire to basically create a Germany without Jews. And it is so central, this anti-Semitism, this desire to rid Germany of Jews, it is so central that even in the last days of the war, in the spring of 1945, when the Red Army is closing in from one direction and the British and the Americans are coming from the other direction, Germany continues to spend resources on killing Jews. In the last part of the war, last few months of the war, especially Hungarian Jews. That you have this devotion to this project almost until the end. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how this happens. I mentioned before that you have, under the Nuremberg laws, the classification of Jews, or the classification of Jews as non-Germans. They are stripped of their citizenship. There's a great deal of, I showed you guys this, right, before? Yeah. There's a great deal of propaganda. Everything from newspapers to children's books, to even you can find, if you have seen, for example, at the Holocaust Museum, they have things like beer mats, coasters, even, that were printed with anti-Jewish slogans. There were exhibitions in 1937, the Nazis, under Hermann Göring, eventually the chief of the Luftwaffe, staged this massive exhibition of degenerate art. Basically, art that is anti-German, art that has been either made by or collected by Jews. Göring was so opposed to this art that he stole most of it for himself and secreted it away. And one of the things, again, maybe you've been following, I guess there's going to be a film about this, I'm not sure when it's coming out, but again, about Jews who had art confiscated, and people are still finding pieces throughout Europe, throughout the world even, in private collections and museum collections, where the provenance, that is, the sort of origins of the piece, the original ownership of the piece, can be traced back to Jews who in the 1930s and 1940s were either forced to give them up, were driven out of their houses, had these things confiscated, etc. You have, as I think I mentioned before, in 1938, you have Kristallnacht. That is, the Jewish migration out of Germany is not happening fast enough for the Nazi leadership. I've mentioned a couple of things that the Nazi leadership wanted to sort of have it both ways. They wanted to strip Jews of all their assets, their bank accounts, their savings, their property, but as it turned out, that made it very hard for Jews to emigrate. Places like the United States and Britain were not willing to take a lot of people without a demonstration of financial capability or a public declaration of financial sponsorship from somebody already in this country. That is one of the few groups that's able to, you might say, sort of proportionately escape from Europe is European Jewish scientists. Because American universities and foundations, everything from Princeton University to the University of Chicago, University of California, Berkeley, are able to put up the funds to recruit, and in some senses to rescue people, starting with people like Einstein in the early 1930s, ultimately including people like Niels Bohr, a Danish physicist, Enrico Fermi, an Italian physicist, the one who actually splits the atom in 1942, I think, or 43, in Chicago, in a squash court of all places. But I don't know if anyone's ever used the squash court since. You have this sort of, outflow of these people, but lots of other Jews are caught in Germany. Either they, in some senses, in fact, said, this will pass, or they lacked the resources to get out. In November 1938, you have Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, in which the Nazi regime basically engages in a pogrom. That is, an organized, state-led, violent outburst against Jews. It's driven by the assassination of a German embassy official in Paris by what seems to have been a person who was insane, a German who was insane, but a German Jew who was not apparently also, not just sort of, psychologically disturbed, but also was profoundly disturbed by what he saw happening in Germany. this is used as an excuse. I may or may not have showed you this map before, but you have in 1938 massive organized attacks on synagogues, on Jewish businesses, and other sites, Jewish homes, other property, etc. By this point, Jews have been stripped of their right to hold any sort of public office, military commission, university posts. A lot of Jewish professionals, like lawyers, and doctors, and engineers, have lost their licenses or their certifications. Again, this is designed to ratchet up the pressure on people to go. In 1939, perhaps to sort of demonstrate just how difficult it is, you have two incidents that bring home how sort of trapped in many ways these European Jews are. By 1939, not only Jews in Germany, but also Jews in Austria. The first is the incident with a boat called the St. Louis. Has anyone ever heard of this? St. Louis in 1939. It was actually a vessel chartered out of the Netherlands of German Jews looking to escape. They didn't all have the correct papers, but they sailed first to the United States, then to Cuba, and then ultimately went back to Europe. Just about everyone, they were refused entry because they did not have the correct papers, they did not have financial sponsorship, they didn't have the ability to demonstrate resources and finances and things like that. Just about every single person on that ship died in German hands between 1939 and 1945, either in the war or in the death camps. It is rather startling. If you go, there was a couple who, friends of my parents, lived up the street from us. The husband had been born in Czechoslovakia, and had his parents had emigrated in 1939 after the Germans took over all of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. His parents emigrated. He was, I think, 3 or 4 years old at the time. And they went first, actually, to Istanbul. And then they went to Portugal. And then ultimately they managed to make their way into the United States when the war was over. But if you go into their house, you would see in the main hallway his parents' wedding picture. His parents are at the center. He's obviously not in the picture. This man is now about 80 years old. And there's all these guests. There's close to 70 people in the picture. Friends, relatives, the rabbi who officiated, all of these people gathered in the picture. Out of them all, only 2, the bride and the groom, were alive in 1945. The rest had been caught up in the Holocaust. Some died of natural causes, just about everyone else died in one of the camps. So it's this massive sort of extermination. That's one thing that I think. But these are people who are lucky to get out. The other event, not only is the St. Louis turned around, but the other event is that in the middle of 1939, when it looks from the British perspective like they're going to have to fight a war. The British, who control Palestine, it's a British territory. They took it over from the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. They had allowed Jewish migration out of Europe to varying degrees in the 20s and 30s. Emigration largely funded by the Zionist organization, which was seeking to make, basically, a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In the middle of 1939, the British make a very, very cynical decision. They decide, we're going to have to fight a war. We're going to have to fight a war with the Germans in the near future, the Germans and the Italians. That war may have to be fought in North Africa. It may involve Egypt, may even involve Palestine. We need to make sure that Palestinian Arabs, that is, and in particular, Palestinian Muslims and Christians, stay on our side during the war. They don't cooperate with the Germans. And what they do is they end, in June 1939, they end all Jewish migration into Palestine, about 3 or 4 months before the war starts, in an effort, ultimately, to appease Palestinian Arab opinion. and to keep them from flirting with, even sort of approaching the Germans to help them against the British in the Middle East. The idea that the British say is that, what is this going to do? Are the Jews going to turn to Germany? Are they going to support the Nazis? No. Therefore, we can take this risk. It's not like European Jews are going to all of a sudden decide that the Nazis are not so bad. So it's a very cynical move, but it cuts off another avenue of escape. That is, the turning around of St. Louis shows that the United States is going to be very wary about admitting European Jews. So too, the sort of ending of what was, for many people, a lifeline to Palestine through the Zionist organization by the summer of 1930. This is a problem for the Germans. One of the things that the Nazis had laid out was that or believed that their specific pressure, their classification of German Jews as non-Germans, that this would ultimately drive German Jews away. The problem is that by 1939, the Nazis are realizing that not enough of them have left, and also that there aren't people out there taking them. One of the few places in the world that actually had taken them in the late 1930s was Istanbul. That is Turkey. At that point, sort of an avowedly secular, but a predominantly Muslim state had taken in more Jews than just about anywhere else in Europe or in the Americas. And you will have some Jews who wind up in Istanbul, other Jews who will actually wind up in Shanghai in 1936 and 1937 through the Japanese conquest. But it is a process that doesn't go as quickly as the Nazi leadership hoped. And by the start of 1939, and especially after the Germans take over Czechoslovakia and realize they're now locked into a course with war with Britain and France, especially they're going to take Poland as they do, then the question becomes, what are you going to do? Because the expansion of German control into Poland, into the western part of the Soviet Union, is going to bring millions of Jews under German control. That is, the German desire for self-sufficiency is going to run into the German desire to remove all Jews as threats to German national well-being and German national sort of self-sufficiency. So in essence, sort of, the Nazi, if you want to say that there's an intention to remove Jews, there's also an intention to create this thousand-year Reich, to attain this Lebensraum, this living space, that will allow for complete autarky or self-sufficiency in Central and Eastern Europe. And that's what's going to happen. What happens between late 1939 and the invasion of the Soviet Union and its progress up until about September of 1941, over that 2-year period, you get a rethinking about what is to be done with European Jews, Polish Jews, and then ultimately Soviet Jews. The initial idea is that Jews will be classified as potential political dissidents, potential resistors. Oftentimes, in 1939 and 1940, you had SS units attached to the German army who were basically allowed to make up Jewish policy on the spot. That is, to organize mass killings. But Jews are being killed as a part of a larger program of getting rid of people who are seen as politically difficult, potentially sort of people who will potentially resist and sabotage the Nazi regime. As the invasion into the Soviet Union progresses, and more Jews are brought under German control, they're still classified as political undesirables. In fact, it's easier to classify them as political undesirables because the Nazis have traditionally associated the Jews with the Bolsheviks, those who basically founded the Soviet Union. So the idea was that, if you're going to get rid of Bolsheviks, you're going to get rid of Jews. Getting rid of one means getting rid of the other. That they are sort of synonymous. Even so, it becomes apparent that you have this massive number of Jews whose existence cannot be justified, cannot be sort of equalized with the existence of this massive new German state. And so starting in late 1941 and into early 1942, the Germans begin to implement the mass murder of Jews not simply as sort of politically undesirable types, but simply as undesirable. That is, Jews must be eliminated. There are various suggestions. Jews will be worked to death. Those Jews who cannot work will be immediately put to death. The Holocaust, as we now understand it, is beginning to take shape in 1940, 1941, early 1942. It originally sort of takes the form of mass machine gun executions of people in forests, in fields, mass graves, thousands of people buried, thousands of people killed and buried in a matter of days. You have special squads, both within the SS and outside the SS, from the army, from the German, what were called police reserves, that is, people who were supposed to follow the army and pacify and control occupied territory. All of them are taking part in these massive killings. But, as the Germans discover, it's not going as quickly as they would like, and it has some problems. The sort of, obviously the enormous moral, ethical problems of mass evil aside, you have this. There is difficulty in getting German soldiers to do this. You have some who will participate again and again. But there's an appreciation of a couple of things. And this was, again, sort of referring to historiography. This was the subject of a book that came out about 25 years ago by a historian named Christopher Browning. It's called Ordinary Men. He teaches in North Carolina now. He's considered probably the foremost expert on the development of the institutionalization of the Holocaust in this period. And he studied a particular police battalion from the city of Hamburg, the port city on the Baltic. And he said, what happens to these guys when they're sent first to Poland, then to the Soviet Union in 40, 41, 42, to participate, specifically to organize and then carry out mass executions of Jews? And what he found was a couple of things. The first was this: not all of those who were supposed to participate actually did. This is one of the sort of strange things that emerges from his research. But there were multiple instances. For some commanders, it was every single time. For others, it was only certain times, where they basically said to their troops, they said to these reserve policemen, if you don't want to participate, say so now. And the people who did not want to participate, a minority, but those who did, they were not punished, they were not shot, they were not imprisoned, they were not sent off to the Eastern Front. They were simply reassigned to other duties. They were told, okay, you guard the trucks while this takes place. You guard the road while this takes place. You will not physically be involved in this killing. It's not by any stretch a majority of people, but there are enough people who step out of line to make it noticeable. And they don't suffer any consequences. One of the things that this research brought up was the whole notion, helped to sort of explode this notion, that those Germans, who had been sort of participating in this, had been basically the captives of the Nazis themselves. Remember I said this sort of rhetoric that the Nazis had sort of taken over Germany. And that ordinary Germans had been, in some senses, sort of brutalized as well. What his research demonstrated is that when there were opportunities for Germans not to participate, or that there were actual opportunities for Germans not to participate, and those who chose not to participate did not suffer any consequences. So the whole argument that people made, I was just following orders, or if I didn't do it, I would be shot, got a lot weaker. Because the idea was that these guys could have stepped out of line. The majority stay in line and participate. Yeah.
So do you think that they chose to not kill them or punish them in any way because of the fact that they need more people behind their idea?
I think there's a profound, it depends on a situation, but as I'll talk about, there's a profound discomfort in Germany as to what's going on. A lot of people know, but there's also this real sort of unwillingness to face. They know, but there's an unwillingness to sort of own up to it. And I think that for German commanders who made this offer to people and then I mean, the German High Command never sanctioned the officers for allowing people to step out of line and refuse to participate. There was this sense that, you know what, enough people are going to do it, that we don't need to do this. That in essence, it would be worse for morale to punish these people. But it's a problem they identify, which is that not everyone is participating, because there is this level of discomfort with it. The majority who do participate, the historian Browning argues a lot of them do so not because they are sort of, absolute rabid anti-Semites from the start. Most of them don't seem to have done that. Most of them weren't even actually members of the Nazi Party originally. But there seems to have been a lot of sort of peer pressure, a lot of sort of reinforcement within the group that it took sort of people who had very strong convictions to step out of line. Otherwise, there was this real reluctance to break the sort of cohesion of the unit or the group. And that only in circumstances where lots of people stepped out of line, a relatively significant number, would you actually have more people step out. Instead, places where one or two people said, I am not going to participate, the vast majority stay in. And he credits, among other things, to this, sort of sense of group cohesion, as they call it in military terms. That is this sort of group loyalty, this peer pressure of no one wanting to step out and mark themselves as different. What became evident, though, was that even those guys who participated, many refused after the first time they did it. To get others to do it continually, you had to basically get them drunk, blind drunk, between massacres. They weren't good for anything else but these mass executions. And by the end of 1941, in Germany, in Berlin, the German leadership is trying to think of a way in which they can execute millions, get rid of, exterminate hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews, but without the problem of so much human agency, of human beings deciding they don't want to participate, or human beings having to get so drunk in order to participate, or in order to recover from participating. That it's not moving quickly enough. There needs to be a better, sort of more efficient way of getting rid of millions of people. By better, I don't mean good. By better, I mean more efficient. And in 1942, there's a conference held, January 30th, 1942, in a suburb of Berlin called Wannsee, W-A-N-N-S-E-E, Wannsee. The person who presides and takes the minutes and organizes it is a man named Adolf Eichmann. E-I-C-H-M-A-N-N. Adolf Eichmann. He'll escape after the war. He'll eventually be arrested by the Israelis in Argentina, brought back to Israel and tried and executed in 1961. It'll be this huge sort of international trial and event. Eichmann is a bureaucrat. That's ultimately what Eichmann's argument will be, that I followed orders, I moved papers, I never actually killed anyone. But at the Wannsee Conference, which Eichmann helps to organize, and which Hitler approves, they meld together this desire to get rid of Jews with something else that exists in Germany from the middle of the 1930s on. This is where things this is how the actual Holocaust that we think of, the camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Sobibor, etc. This is how it takes place. Because in Germany in the 1930s, not only do you have an effort to remove Jews, but you also have an effort to basically cleanse, you might say, the population. There is a massive eugenics program enacted by the Nazis. Not only were they interested in removing Jews, but they were also interested in basically improving the health of their populations. Eugenics being the idea that, the rather sort of spurious idea, that you can somehow genetically manipulate a population to make it strong. That you can identify those whose genes are troublesome, weaker, incline them towards antisocial behavior, crime, deviant behavior, whatever you want to call it, and you can eliminate them. In the 1930s, in Germany, the Nazis implemented a policy of mass involuntary sterilization. I think I mentioned this before. But mass sterilization of the disabled, both physically and psychologically, of people convicted of certain crimes, of people judged to be mentally deficient. And this takes place in institutions, and prisons, and hospitals throughout Germany in the period from about 1935 to 1939. Several 100,000 people are sterilized, maybe even close to 500,000. No one's quite sure of the exact numbers. But you develop this bureaucracy designed to carry this out. As I think I mentioned before, this entire program is based on the state of Virginia's sterilization program, which had been approved by the Supreme Court in 1927. The Nazis literally referred to it when they had sort of discussions about how they're going to frame their sterilization program. They say the Virginia one is the model. So you have this effort to sort of control the population, to remove undesirable elements from within the population. As war approaches in 1939, this program shifts its emphasis. These buses or vans pulled up outside of a mental hospital near Berlin, there's a picture taken in early 1940, are evidence of a new program that's put in place. A program that is sort of euphemistically called the Nazi euthanasia program. The idea being that there are undesirable people, there are extra mouths to feed, Germany's going to war, these people cannot help, there will only be a drain on German resources, therefore they must be eliminated. And starting in the summer of 1939 and continuing until about the spring of 1941, it's the one instance in which German popular pressure seems to have forced the Nazis to change. Because more and more people became aware of what was going on. German church leaders, people in the German public generally, became aware of what was going on, which was that people were missing. People were dying at mental hospitals and in prisons. The euthanasia program extended to newborns who had immediate and obviously identifiable physical or mental disabilities. That is, children would be born, the parents would be told that the child had to be resuscitated, the child was in distress, this, that, the other child had done it. There is created a bureaucracy in 1939 in Germany to administer this program. A bureaucracy that by 1940 has developed this idea. Rather than killing people individually, it will kill them collectively with gas. They will use these gas vans, put patients, inmates, those classed as undesirable, into them. Their bodies will then be cremated. Their families and others will be told they died during a medical procedure, they died of stroke, they died of pneumonia, anything that could be possibly been done. And people started to get wind of this. It was very hard to hide this. The presence of these vans, the disappearance of people. All told, I think it's about 100,000 people are killed in this way in Germany. This includes children through the elderly. And it causes, ultimately, this public backlash, where the Nazis abandon it by the spring of 1941, by which point they've already killed a significant number of people within Germany itself. Not Jews, not people who are seen as non-German, but people who are seen as too weak, too vulnerable, too sort of dependent on the resources of the state at the time of war. So you have this bureaucracy. You have the sort of development of technology for mass execution. The use of gas. They experimented with various gases. At some points, they used carbon monoxide, hooking up exhaust pipes from these vans. Eventually using a gas that comes known as Zyklon B, this chemical sort of nerve agent. what you have is this bureaucracy, a pre-existing bureaucracy concerned with the elimination of undesirable people. And what happens, what's done at the Wannsee Conference, is basically the melding together of two things: the need to eliminate Jews from German territory and an existing system for killing people. That is, that's when the Holocaust takes the shape we now think of it, primarily as, or in which we now think of it. That is, the death camp system, the sort of infrastructure of railways, work camps, labor camps, and extermination camps. That comes out of the Wannsee Conference. And it basically, they take a lot of people who were involved in planning the euthanasia program and carrying it out, and they transfer them now to this new responsibility, the mass extermination of Jews. So you have basically these programs, elimination of Jews, and a program to eliminate other undesirables. Eventually, when there are no other options but to eliminate Jews, this program used for undesirables in Germany itself is transferred to be used on Jews. Transferred and expanded exponentially. And the result is the creation of the death camp system in Europe. That is, you have, as you can see here, the names of the ones that sort of stick in public memory. Troniki, Treblinka, Sobibor near Treblinka, Belzec, Chelmno, Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, right here. All of these, and this is basically, what you can see here is different marks. These ones here with the sort of white and black, those are the extermination camps. The other ones were organized to transfer people from population centers towards the camps. But the major sort of extermination camps are right here in Poland, designed to bring people from the western part of the Soviet Union, Poland, and people from Western Europe there. That's where Primo Levi is going to go, to Auschwitz, when he's captured in 1943 in northern Italy. One of the things that needs to be stressed about this system is that, it's very bureaucratic, it's very institutionalized. It is sort of a mechanized system of extermination. Trains, the use of technology for killing people, the use of mass crematoria for removing dead bodies, removing the evidence of dead bodies. There's a couple of things built into this system, and I think this goes back to the question we had about, people who stepped out of line and participation. There is, within Germany, this is the other thing. If you want to talk about sort of, were Germans blind to what was going on? I think instead, there is an understanding of what's going on. But there's an understanding among those who are actually carrying it out, those who are observing it, those who simply know what's going on. There's an understanding of it, but there's an unwillingness to actually be present for it. That is, there is a degree to which I think Germans, especially those carrying out this program, know exactly what they are doing, know exactly the evil that they are carrying out, and are uncomfortable with it. Not so uncomfortable with it that they will abandon it, but uncomfortable with it enough that they build in these sort of systems of remove, degrees of remove or space between themselves and what actually happens at the camp. And this happens in a couple of ways. In the first place, the architects of this, people like Eichmann, they are not ever really going to go out into the camp system. They're going to stay in Berlin. They will order the materials, approve the plans, see the railway lines drawn up and constructed, but they're not actually going to go and carry any of this out themselves. It's how Eichmann and others can argue that I was just a paper pusher. I may have signed lots of things, but it doesn't mean that I actually killed someone. And there's a lot of this sort of built in. And what it means is in some ways, I think, sort of unclear. Does it mean that some Germans felt that they were being forced to do this, but they didn't want to have any actual sort of contact with it? were others sort of willing to do it. They were willing to live with the idea of the mass murder of Jews so long as they didn't have to actually participate. They didn't have to actually see it. Was it fear? Was it simply discomfort? It's not quite sure. But there's definitely something there, whereby system sort of buffers are built in so that those carrying this out and designing this don't actually have to face the consequences of what they're doing. Whether because it made them uncomfortable, whether because it brought them up too close to what they were doing, whether because they did this in order to try and sort of save themselves from what they perceive might be some eventual punishment for this. But it's not simply the idea that there's sort of a bureaucratic entity running this, and then there's the camps out here. But there's several things built into the camp structure. In the first place, while the people who managed the camps were by and large German, the people who had the most direct contact with many of the prisoners, especially at the extermination camps, not necessarily some of the other labor camps, but the extermination camps, were guards who were drawn from non-German populations. That is, as the Germans advanced into eastern Poland, into the Western Soviet Union, Poles, Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Belarusians, Estonians, you had members of this population who welcomed the Germans because they said, you know, we obviously don't like Stalin. We're much happier that you're here. They volunteered to fight for the Germans. Some of them did actually participate in military engagements. Many others were funneled after 1942 into this system, whereby actual Germans did not have a lot to do with the movement of people off of trains into gas chambers. The selection of people could take place, but the actual handling of people, the actual physical movement of people, was not in the hands of Germans. There seemed to be an understanding that it was going to be very hard to get Germans to do this. Some would, but one of the interesting things, if you follow the news in the last decade or so about Nazi war criminals being found in this country, is that a large proportion of them are not actually German. They're Ukrainian or Lithuanian or Estonian. And they are people who were in essence either volunteered to fight with the Germans or were pressed into service by the Germans and wound up serving as the death camp guards. Again, you've built in this level of this layer of sort of non-accountability. The other thing is that once people had been killed, the responsibility for removing their belongings, at times removing their hair, gold fillings, sort of parceling out and dividing up belongings they brought with them, all of that fell not to Germans or camp administrators, by and large, but it fell to other Jews, Jews in labor camps around these death camps. Jews who made up what were called the Sonderkommando. It means the special unit, or the special group. They were the ones assigned to take the bodies out of the gas chamber, to place them in the crematorium, to keep the sort of, this sort of process of removing and destroying evidence going. After 3 or 4 months, they usually would be killed themselves. But you have, again, built in this idea that it's intermediaries who are going to do the work. Whether it's Jews, whether it's other non-Germans, you're going to have this level of removal. You will have camp commanders, you will have medical officers and others who will be German, but there is a real sort of dedicated effort to trying to keep a large part of the German military, even the German SS, away from the direct engagement in the camps. I mean, it's one of the things that after the war, even the German army will argue. The German army will argue that the war crimes and the death camps, the extermination camps, all of these are products solely of the SS. The regular German army is innocent. The German army didn't do anything. But of course, the German army knew. The German army protected the routes that were used for the death camps. The German army at times contributed labor for the building of them. The German army set out to recruit and to capture prisoners of war who might be turned into camp guards and other sort of workers in these institutions. So you have this element, you can't say, well, yes, I know they were going on, but I wasn't directly involved. Something that the German army very much wanted to stress throughout the war, and something what historical research has generally exploded in the last 20, 25 years. That is that the culpability or the responsibility of the German army is still fairly significant no matter what people protested after the war. So you have a situation whereby the Germans build a, so you might say, so the machinery of extermination. And where I think you can argue that the vast majority of Germans know that something's going on, maybe not all down to all the details, and at least it seems are willing to live with what goes on, albeit willing to live so long as there is a sort of cushion or buffer between them and what's actually happening at the camps. Sometimes even if not an actual buffer of sort of physical removal or using intermediaries, simply an unwillingness to acknowledge things. To know that a camp is there, especially the transit camps throughout Germany, throughout northern Germany and eastern Germany, to sort of acknowledge that they're there, but to basically not seek out any knowledge as to where these people are actually going. You have a case, therefore, I think that within Germany, there is an acceptance of the idea that Jews will no longer live in German territory. Built into that, implicitly, is an acceptance that whatever means are taken will be, or that are justifiable, are legitimate. When it comes to setting up the actual means, when it comes to setting up the actual system, there is discomfort. We've seen it in the ordering of mass executions by these police units in 41, early 42. We see it in the construction of this camp that has all of these sort of, you might say, sort of removes or levels of accountability, responsibility, and contact built into it. At the end of the war, I mean, there is going to be this huge argument. Who in Germany is culpable? It's an argument that's going to be shaped not only by sort of the historical record, but also by the political necessities of the day. One in which acknowledging exactly the scope and scale of participation in this is going to be problematic. That the rehabilitation of Western Germany, of West Germany in particular, is going to, by the early 1950s, take precedence over an accounting of what actually happened. But what you can see here is, I think, what I've tried to lay out is that this is not something that emerged, that is part of the Nazi plan. This death camp system, as it looks there, is not part of the plan in 1933. But it's also something that many Germans in 1933 would not necessarily have recoiled from, so long as they did not directly have to be used. All right, we'll leave it there. We will talk about Levy. Think next time about, in particular, one of the things that Levy will stress is, and something that's often used as a subtitle for another book, is what is a man? And we can translate it perhaps a little bit more broadly as, what is a human being? What does it take to be a human being? How does the process of dehumanization work in the camps? And think about it not only from the perspective of those who run the camps, but also dehumanization from the perspective of those trying, as he puts it, to survive in the camps. All right, I will see you all. Please come prepared to discuss, even if you're not writing a paper, next time. Thank you.
Writing the paper on this one? What exactly were you looking for? I guess
Well, I've got those questions.
Oh yeah, just to answer those questions.
Yeah, you're answering one of those questions
Okay.
in a 2 to 3 page paper response. Yeah.
Just wanted to
Really good.
Yeah.
It's hard to do it in 2.
Yeah, 2 to 3 is great. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
It's possible if I can change my decision.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Here, just grab yours out of here.
Yeah.
There you go.
So do you think that one of the reasons they forced the other prisoners to go through and just take things off the bodies and stuff and to dispose of them
Yeah.
was to further dehumanize them, so that they were so far removed from the people that they once were, they did